Hi, hello. Today I'm going to show you how to make this Roman bust. Definitely not the love of my life or anything weird. It's also an aquarium, so I'll show you how to make these little fish a little home. So first I glued together some foam panels to serve as the inside of the clay. This was pretty cheap and saved me some money. However, it wasn't that strong, so the sculpture actually fell over a couple times. And if I could do it again, I'd have a steel rod through the middle, providing more support. I then surrounded the foam with Laguna 100 clay, which the internet told me was good for something like this, and then started just throwing it on. I had a little bit of problem balancing the whole boxy aquarium look versus an actual person, but I did the best I could. I then just used my hands and some $8 tools off of Amazon to start crafting the clay. I really wish I had watched some YouTube videos beforehand to kind of give myself some kind of knowledge about it. It would have saved me a ton of time, but instead I just had a picture of a similar looking sculpture next to me, and I just used that as a reference point throughout the process. My biggest problem is that I'd be looking down at the piece and it would look great from 2D, and then I would shift my position or move around the piece, and then it would look terrible because it wasn't 3D. So I constantly had to go back and change parts to adjust the 3D depth or what have you, and I could have saved a ton of time just doing my research beforehand. So because I had made the foam so boxy, I had to add a lot more clay to the shoulders to round them out and make it look more natural. But that made the head look really small, and so I had to add more clay to the head until it eventually looked like a human. For the beard, I actually did look up stuff online. I found two methods to make it look like realistic hair. One I used for the beard, which is essentially just gouging out lines enough that it makes it look like hair. And then the second I used on the hair on top of the head, which is longer and thicker 3D chunks that kind of cascade down. Now for the eyes, I kind of messed up in the beginning and I made them very, very small and close together. It was also tough because I would make one eye look really good, and then I tried to do the same on the other eye, and it would look good in its own right, but when put together they looked terrible. So I had to eventually adjust and adjust until it started to look a little bit better. This is the second hair technique that I referenced earlier. Essentially you take kind of thicker spaghetti looking strings of clay and drape it over the sculpture's head. They cascade down and kind of form layers to make it look like a more authentic hair look. So with that, the clay portion is done and I start making the mold. First, I spray the entire thing with shellac. This will make sure that the clay retains its shape while you're making the mold on top of it. So the mold technique I use has two layers. One is a rubber layer and one is a much harder support layer. The rubber layer picks up all the detail from the clay, and then the backer layer kind of supports that in the mold. So you can see here I'm mixing the rubber together. I use smooth on rubber and applying a very thin coat to the sculpture that is then backed by a much more thicker 3 or 4 coats of rubber to make sure that it really picks up the detail as well as doesn't break when you take the mold off. Now after you've done all the rubber layers, you want to create a much harder, thicker backer layer to support the rubber. In order to do that, you're going to create barriers and divide your sculpture with clay. These clay walls help keep the backer layer separate so you can take them off at the end. I only did 2, the front and the back, and this caused issues later, so make sure you divide it into 3 portions in a 360-degree axis. Make the clay thick, 3 to 4 inches, or else you're going to have a lot of trouble separating the plaster after you're done. That backer layer had 3 components. One was a very hard layer of hydrocal, one was plaster of Paris strips to provide some strength, and then third was another layer of hydrocal just to round it out. At the end of the day, there were 6 components to the sculpture, to the mold itself, and it looked a little like this. Now, if you made the clay walls correctly, it'll be pretty easy to separate the mold pieces. I did not, so I had to use a lot of tools to separate the pieces. Also, like I said before, I made the front and the back portions instead of 3 portions in a 360-degree axis, and so that made it harder to pull out some of the clay and some of the rubber. After I cleared out all the clay, I had to wash the rubber pretty well, and then I was left with 2 pieces just like this for each layer. For this project, I used glass fiber reinforced concrete. This differs from normal concrete, which uses rebar or metal to provide the strength inside it, with just glass fibers. So you can make it very, very skinny, very, very thin, and it still has the strength of normal concrete. In order to do it, you use a backer coat, so it's a very thin just layer that you're going to see, and then the glass fiber layer is going to go on top of it to provide the strength. By far, my biggest problem with this project was just the materials I used. Concrete, resin, totally fine. The materials that are used to support these, like foam or clay, left behind all these residues that became impossible to clean afterwards. So if I were to do this again, I would still use concrete and resin, but instead of using foam and clay, I would use maybe plastic that could be removed really easily in one piece, as opposed to picking out all of these left behind remnants. The first concrete pour had some issues, but I was able to fix those pretty easily with another concrete pour. I had to use a bonding agent with it in order to make it stick to the original concrete, but it wasn't that much of a problem. For the head, after I removed it from the form, from the mold, it looked pretty good and it was much better than the other pieces. In order to make the concrete waterproof, I use a specialty aquarium-based resin in order to make sure that it was a fish-friendly and waterproof solution for it. In this frame you can see the 3 parts, the bottom, the middle, and the head. These will be joined together with the blue resin later on. For the head itself, I just joined the 2 pieces with some instant cement and had no problem with that, making sure it was one piece. For the resin pour, I duct taped the bottom layer and the middle layer together and then added some foam in between to mimic the final shape of the sculpture. I then turned it on its side and used a whiteboard material to be the backer for the resin and give it that really smooth finish that I wanted. I then took clay and plugged up all the holes that I could see between the whiteboard and the actual cement in order to make sure that it was sealed. I created the blue coloring with a little bit of just simple resin dye. You want to make sure that you get the non-opaque stuff so that you can see through it. Just a tiny, even like a quarter of a drop will do more than enough. I had that version, the first version that you saw, and that was way too blue, and so I redid it with a much lighter color that you can see here. The clay I used to seal the resin mold caused 2 issues. One, as I already said, caused a lot of problems later on with cleaning it. But number 2, it just didn't provide a very good seal, so that the resin actually leaked out a couple times and I had to come back and refill it. So just make sure that everything is sealed up before you do a resin pour. After the 2 larger resin pours were done, I removed all the stuff in the middle, the foam, the whiteboard material, and then just flipped it on its side and started another resin pour. In order to clean the inside after the resin pours were done, I just used water and soap and got my hands in there and just scrubbed. I had to do it a couple times just to get all the muck out. But after I was done, I was able to focus on the outside. I did my best just to clean it up a little bit and shave off some of the left behinds, the resin left behinds, maybe some of the clay and stuff like that, just to make it look a little bit better after I was done. I had a ton of fun making this guy and learned a lot of new techniques. I've named the fish Et, Tu, and Brutus because I think that's hilarious, but it probably is not. I have a really cool project coming up on the docket, so feel free to hit like and subscribe, and that way you'll be able to see them as soon as they come out. Really cool stuff, really cool projects, and thank you for watching.